It's not, I think there are other voters, particularly, those in his base and even some swing voters who are able to compartmentalize this and, say, look, this isn't the only thing I'm basing my decision on who I'm going to vote for on.
Yeah. Well, so that's Kamala Harris there speaking in Washington just in the last few moments, referring to picking up on General John Kelly, the former chief of staff to Donald Trump, describing Donald Trump as a fascist. And that was, well, soon after it had emerged that General Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had described Donald Trump as being fascist to the core. And that is an exact quote, according to the respected journalist Bob Woodward in his latest book. Can you get your thoughts on this, Kate and Mikey? But I also want to bring in now to our conversation Julia Manchester, who is the US politics reporter at The Hill, speaking to us now live on the line from Washington, D.C. Hello to you, Julia.
Hey, John, thanks for having me.
Hi. Well, I keep using the word extraordinary because I need to stop doing that because it's becoming worn out altogether. But that reaction from Kamala Harris following the comments of General John Kelly and Mark Milley, and you can hear something every bit as extraordinary in a moment from General Ben Hodges. But what do you make of all of this, Julia?
Yeah, I feel like extraordinary is thrown around, unprecedented thrown around. I mean, that's been, I think, our lives covering this really for the past 8, 9 years in US politics. But look, what you saw from the Harris campaign speaking just now in Washington, D.C., with the vice president addressing reporters is essentially them, I think, in some sort of a way, trying to make this the October surprise of this election or one of the October surprises
Yeah.
of this election. They're trying to seize on it. We saw Governor Tim Walz, her running mate, do that last night while campaigning with Barack Obama. Tim Walz, of course, talking about his own military background. He served in the National Guard. Certainly a very damning report in the Atlantic and then in the New York Times with former Trump's chief of staff, John Kelly, confirming this. It's important to note that the Trump campaign is vehemently denying this. In the Atlantic, there were two sources, I think, that backed this up. But overall, I would say, the question is this going to impact the 2024 election results? And quite frankly, I think a lot of us have sort of here in the States covering this aren't necessarily sure it even will.
Yes.
Remember, this isn't the first time something like this has happened with Donald Trump. In 2016, you had that very infamous Access Hollywood tape with Donald Trump bragging about sexually assaulting women, for example. And then you had his comments in 2015 after he announced that he was running for election, criticizing former Senator John McCain, who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, saying, "I like people who aren't captured. Those are winners,"
Yes.
etc. So Trump has a history of this. And even though it's certainly clear that there are voters who are unhappy about this, that they like to push this aside, that they, this does kind of reinforce their dislike for Donald Trump and
Yeah.
their urge to vote for someone else. It's not, I think there are other voters, particularly, those in his base and even some swing voters who are able to compartmentalize this and, say, look, this isn't the only thing I'm basing my decision on who I'm going to vote for on.
Yeah, it's not at all clear that to hear the former president, the runner for the presidency, being described as a fascist is going to move the dial at all, which is extraordinary in itself. Which shows that the abnormal has now become something like normal. And look at what they've been saying on this, Kate and Mikey. We've had General Kelly there. We've heard from Mark Milley, and I spoke just very short while ago on the program to General Ben Hodges, who was the U.S. Army commander in Europe. Asked him what he thought about this suggestion from his fellow former generals in the Pentagon, accusing Trump of being a fascist. What happened in Germany in the 1930s was the rise of the Nazi Party under Adolf Hitler. And there was General Ben Hodges, talking about in terms of the same thing in some way happening again. I mean, where do you go with this, Kate? The abnormal is now normal, and these are not Donald Trump's straight-up Democratic Party opponents. These are general officers, 3- and 4-star generals, who stand for the principle and concepts of honor in the United States, taking this line too.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously kind of an astonishing criticism. It's such a strong criticism. I'm interested in the guy quoted in the New York Times. I'm interested because he's served for Trump for 2 years, it looks like, looking at the story.
John Kelly.
Yeah, John Kelly, sorry. So I'm interested to know what their relationship has been like since.
Probably not great.
No, but I mean, I guess what I'm interested to know is what criticisms has he made of the Trump presidency over those years? And also, I think we heard, didn't we, during that first Trump presidency, how elements of the US state were trying to act kind of almost despite the president. And I'd be interested to know a bit more about that, like what moves he maybe took to try and proof the state from what he thought was a dangerous president.
Yeah, well, it's now not suggested, it is known, it is spoken out loud that Donald Trump is surrounding himself by advisors far more likely to follow his will than were many of his senior advisors at that time.
Yeah.
His closest circle, but many of whom have now repudiated him entirely and said, you cannot vote for Donald Trump again. Well, he has much more loyal people around him now. A second term would be quite unlike the first term in that regard, Mikey.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the second term, Donald Trump is not 2016 Donald Trump. He is older, he is angrier, and he doesn't have the quote-unquote sensible people around him that he had first time round. Yeah. Because, as you say, they've all realised that, okay, sometimes when he says these things, he's serious, and have deserted him because they don't want to be attached to that. I think there is a risk sometimes that we fall into. I think in the first Trump presidency, there was a lot of people sort of leant towards, he doesn't really mean it, he's just saying things. And quite often his campaign team will say, he's just talking, he's just Trump being Trump. But then something like January 6th happens and you realise, actually, he kind of liked that. Maybe that was who he was all along. And maybe we should have, when someone tells you who they are, you should listen.
Yeah, well, I mean, you still hear frequently some of Donald Trump's supporters on Capitol Hill, congressmen and women and senators, suggesting on his side that his bark's worse than his bite, shouldn't take this stuff too literally. But the language of Donald Trump gets more and more extravagant. Let me welcome Anna Johnson, who is the AP Washington Bureau Chief. Anna, welcome to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
It's lovely to have you here. And what's an election campaign you are covering there that we are watching all over the world? Allegations of election interference thick in the air. We've got former senior U.S. Army generals, Marine generals, accusing the former president of being a fascist.
Yes, it's been an intense and really sort of a whirlwind campaign. I mean, particularly over the summer, where you saw, from when the former President Donald Trump, there were, he's had 2 attempted assassination attempts against him, and then of course President Biden dropping out of the race and Vice President Kamala Harris coming into the race. I mean, it's been intense and unpredictable past several months leading all the way up to November 5th.
Yeah, just discussing the night itself, election night, Anna, because the American news networks and organizations like you, AP, particularly you at AP, you've got a very particular role in calling the election result before it becomes finally certified and approved. It's almost a constitutional function. Tell us more about that.
It's a really unique role that the AP, the Associated Press, plays in American democracy. When the founders of the United States, had elections and delegated them to the states, the one thing that there isn't and that they didn't account for was a national body or some sort of federal entity that would sort of tally up all the results in the presidential election and declare a winner in the presidential election. So the AP, all the way back in 1848, so which is a couple years after we were founded, decided to step in and play that role. And at the time, in our first presidential election that the AP called, we called it for Zachary Taylor. And we've been doing it ever since. It's obviously gotten a lot bigger, a lot more complicated. But that's essentially the reason why media outlets like the AP, this is what we do. We count the vote, we get in the results, we analyze them, we look at all the data, and then we do make race calls. Once we're 100% certain.
And a number of large news organizations and broadcast networks look to you at AP to give the definitive call on what the result is going to be. I'm sure you're going to be doubly cautious, triply cautious this year, given the sensitivity about this election, the suspicion and the accusation of foul play that will be flying about. Do you expect Anna, do you expect to be able to call the presidential result on the night?
We don't know. I mean, that will really all determine how close this race is. It's not really a matter of us being extra cautious. I mean, we uphold the same standard that we always do, is when we are absolutely certain that there's no path forward based on all of the analysis we've done, all of the vote information, everything that we have, that there's no path forward for the trailing candidate to overtake the leading candidate, we'll make the race call. But if a race is really, really close, and because states across the US do things differently, they count ballots differently, they release the timing of those differently, it may, if it's really close, take longer than, on election night or the wee hours of the day after. It may take longer than that. And we're prepared for any kind of outcome in that regard.
Yeah, I think 3 out of the last 4 presidential elections did lead to the result being called on the night. I mean, not yet finally certified. There were disputes and so on, but the networks did call it, like you did call it on the night in 3 out of the last 4. Since the last election, there have been various changes in election rules state to state. Will that affect the timing of calls this time round?
I mean, it could in comparison to 2020, when obviously it did take longer for the AP and other media to make that race call in the presidential race. Some of the states have, made some changes or brought in, new equipment to speed up that vote count, to have it go faster. But then again, if it's really close, and because certain states, like let's use Pennsylvania, for example, that can't really process its mail-in ballots, all the early voting that it has until after polls close. I mean, it could just take a longer time as a result, if indeed the race is really close in some of those key battleground states.
So it could be early hours of the morning. It could be the early hours of the morning, a week or two later.
It could be at any time. We don't know. We can't, if I had a magic ball and could predict it, that would be great. I'm sure everyone would appreciate that. But, we don't know when it's going to be. And it really sort of depends on a myriad of things. And again, it's, elections in the United States are really complicated. We think of it sort of as election day in this one election, but really each state does it differently. And within those states, they have, it's a myriad of different elections and different election rules in place. And so it really just matters how it plays out. But you're right, previous to that, there had been many races, many presidential elections that had been called either on election day itself, late at night, but on election day itself, or in the early morning hours of the following day. And so it's possible that could happen again this year too.